Okay. So thank you. In this segment of Enthinkment, I want to explore the word and think and in thinking and what that means. Now we've been meeting several years now since the publication of the Management Thought of Louis Ralph Pondy, and its subtitle is about Enthinkment. And in that book, I wrote an analysis of everything my mentor, Louis Ralph Pondy, had ever written, every lecture he'd ever given that I had access to, personal documents I had, personal meetings I had with him. So it was a labor of love. Uh, and I actually found mistakes that publications had made in his work. Uh, like he was known for the conflict episode model, and they left out one of the feedback loops in the model in Administrative Science Quarterly, and they're supposed to be better than that. But anyway, we there was an incident at University of Illinois where Carl Weick and Lou Pondy were walking along the cornfields. Have you ever been to Illinois and Champaign-Urbana? It's all cornfields, which is really good for us students, doctoral students at the time, because our faculty were actually there. They had no place to go but walk in a cornfield. So it was a good place in the middle of Illinois there. And it happened that they were talking about Carl Weick's very famous theory of enactment, how we enact sense, make sense. He calls it sense making, as a book called Sense Making. And we, of course, enact senses by the five senses we have. Uh, and we try to make sense of things. And when it comes to narrative, are people narrating to one another. We make sense by the words and by the tones of the words, a little bit by the body language. I tend to put a lot of focus on context, etc. And we tend not to go much deeper than that, but the work I've done tries to go deeper than that. And and thus the word enactment, how we enact our sense making, is very popular in, I think, everybody that studies management, organization, behavior, org theories probably has been exposed to that work. Um, and so Carl Weick is going on about how enactment, we make sense of the world. And Lou Pondy said something about, well, what about how we question our thinking? And we have thinking, and that kind of interprets our sense making and distorts our sense making, etc. And then Lou thought about it and said, no, then we'd have to call it enthinkment. And that was the term, that was the moment of his using that one time before he died at the age of 49. And I happened to know him a few years as a doctoral student. In fact, he got me my start at UCLA and everything else in my life. My first book, so many mentoring things the man did. I just, told me how to stand at a conference and get invited to dinner by senior people in the academy, things like that. So this is what you do, David. I said, okay, I'll try that. And it worked. But now it comes a time when this author, Martin Heidegger, back in the 1930s, uh, has a book, right? Let's see if you'll be able to see that, called Mindfulness, right? You never think of Martin Heidegger as being mindful, you know? He's about being and becoming and the nature of our existence or how we interpret the existence. But the work I've done with Sabine over the past, I don't want to say how many years because you might sound older, Sabine, but it's a few years. Let's say it's a half a dozen years. Could be 10. And we always work together, Sabine and I, in teaching the advanced courses at the university to doctoral students. So they'd get an understanding of what thinking is about. How do we think? Now, John Dewey wrote a book on thinking, how we think. But this is a little bit different approach that Heidegger takes. And the exciting thing here for us in this think tank, we call it Enthink Circle, is Heidegger actually uses the word in think and in thinking maybe 50 times in the book. And I want to just maybe show you a paragraph. I'm going to read a paragraph just to show you how complex this is to try to decipher. Okay, we heard, simple plots and complex plots. So this is a very simple plot, complex plot that Heidegger is springing on us. And it's a paragraph that's on page 110 and a little bit from 111. And he says that we're obsessed on page 110 with historical calculation. And he talks about how we can ground our thinking, or he says, and the claims of grounding are not in thinking of being, is a direct quote on page 110. So if we're not in thinking and we're claiming that we're grounding, that's a big deal that I'll explain in a minute. And then a quote is, we're in thinking of being is never a matter of generating being so that being would ever become a matter of having been thought. So right there, we know that in thinking of being, because that's a direct quote, is not going to generate something having been thought. So there's a kind of a puzzle there to start to work out. And then over on page 111, he says, and thinking is the enowned, ENOWNED, like we're owning it, reaching into the clearing of refusal into abground, he calls it ground, which is swaying of being itself as its truth. Okay, so I can't, right there in those 2, 3 sentences, Heidegger has opened up some things that are not in Being and Time. And they're not in the metaphysics book either. The whole idea that being is swaying connotes a kind of a movement that's happened, a kind of a rhythm, a kind of disruption, a kind of dissensus, a kind of forces moving in different directions. And so if we're trying to use sense making with our 5 senses of that swaying, we're not going to get very far. The other thing that relates, and I'll throw it open, is the whole notion of grounding our thinking or grounding our sense making. So there's a whole philosophical, methodological trend called grounded theory, which is a methodology students use to ground their observations of what's happening in an organization, usually. And then what they do is they interview, they do focus groups, they do some questionnaires, whatever they do. And then they try to interpret that and they call it reaching the ground. My premise is they're nowhere near the ground. They have no idea what ground is. They've never picked up a hoe or a rake in their life. They don't know what a wheelbarrow is. It's far from ground. And I think what Heidegger is observing here with inventing this word in thinking is that it's an ability to question being and look for the swaying going down, look for the movement in being. And if they're looking for the movement in being and they're thrown into being, thrownness, that's in being and time, we're thrown into being, yeah. And we have a kind of an abrupt startledness of our attunements to being. And there's some attunements in the book here with mindfulness that and why is this important? You're probably saying, well, David, why do you even care about this stuff? Well, because I think there's something deeper going on than the five senses, okay? And it has to do with the emotions and the kinds of thoughts we have about what's happening in the swaying of being. And we're trying to understand what is going down in our lives, in other people's lives. And if we just stay at the level of Weich's enactment, we're not going to get there. And if we stay at the level of grounded theory, those methodologies, if they don't get us to ground, maybe Heidegger has a better understanding of ground. And that's about as far as I got with it. I could make you more confused than you already are, which I don't want to do. Um, but I'll just say when Sabine has the book, which she has now, and starts to go through it in the German and the English and all the rest of it, I think we're going to get a good grounding. Well, I shouldn't use the word grounding. I think we'll find out the nature of ground and the swaying of being in a more precise way than I've presented here. So I'll throw it
You
open.
know, and as we have seen, David, many a time, right, that the translations are not infrequently approximations. And, where it isn't necessarily a good correspondence to what he actually said.
Right.
And I feel that I have a big question mark when it comes to the swaying, for instance. It's like, okay, what did he actually use here in the German, in
I'm
swaying,
waiting to
and in
find
what
out,
sense?
Sabine. I'm waiting.
I know, but David, I just finished this and I'm gonna go on to this.
Oh, I'm so happy.
Okay.
That's the mindfulness book. Well, that's
I
why I
will
went and
go
ordered the
on to
book. I
this.
rushed it over to your house. I dropped it
I
off on
know
your
you
front
did,
porch.
David. I know you
I
did.
said, I need Sabine. We need some
Ah, David,
Sabineness
thank you.
here.
And thank you for the beautiful inscription. I really appreciate that too. That is lovely. But now that I finished poetics, I mean, for me, actually, I have to say, I like, I like learning about how things build one up on the other. So I think that's why one of the reasons why I went to Aristotle. It's like because, you're going to the foundations. And that's, I think, what I want to do. So I'm going to do, more Aristotle, Plato. I mean, these are the foundations of what was to follow. And then how was that modified? How was that built? What was taken? What was continued? And I will get to this because I hope I can find the German online. There's a chance of this because I really have, as you know, huge question marks about the translations, and it can really throw you off if it
Oh,
is
yeah.
only partially right, because he was very precise in what he meant.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think so
And,
too.
Sabine, I have an idea that would be good for you to look for in the German. Swaying, which is rather vague in English,
I know.
has yeah, has something to do with the idea of thrownness. This is a hypothesis. Thrownness is when, in spite of ourselves, we're put in a situation, of course, that we have no agency in thrownness. And swaying, I'm wondering if it's one of the things that happens as a result of our being thrown in the world. There is a movement, one direction or the other, which we may or may not have opted for. So look that up at the same time. When you get to
I
swaying, see if the connection is with thrownness.
You
Okay,
got some
let me write
homework.
that down.
Mhm.
Because good point, Betty, because the thrownness, that also is movement. You're like,
Mhm.
okay, here you go. Here you are in
Mhm.
this world, now do something, right? And
He,
it's
he
like,
also makes up
Yes.
the word for ground. He uses the word abground. Like he has several
Oh,
terms for ground. Doesn't just have one term, of course. It wouldn't be Heidegger. So AB
well,
dash
an
ground.
Abgrund, I mean, the German, I mean, I'm just talking off the cuff. I have not read this
That's
clarification,
okay.
but Abgrund is actually, you know, abyss.
Well, there
But
you go.
then,
That's a big definition of
but
ground
on
right
the
there.
other hand, having said that, I can't assume that, he might have put a totally different meaning onto this. And when he puts hyphens in, which he does,
Yeah.
the hyphen has a specific meaning too. I mean, he could have just write it without the hyphen, and that means something too. And this is all stuff, all details that need to be explored,
Well,
I think.
I'm glad you're here. I'm going to turn off the
Oh,
recording now.
well, I will